All right, so the reason we are here tonight, in part, is because of our shared belief that technology affects everyone, and so it should include everyone. I myself have been laughing at guys like this for at least a year and rolling my eyes at all the Bitcoin stuff. And DeeDee has been chastising me to say, actually, the technology is really, really interesting and we should take a look at it. And so finally, we're doing this. About 3.5 weeks ago, I basically knew nothing about this. And I was hoping that it would all just go away because it was annoying. It's not going away. Bitcoin might be going away, but the technology behind it, blockchain, is not going away. And I have spent the last 3 weeks learning about this. And so tonight, I would like to share with you the perspective of a beginner, my journey about understanding what this is and why it's important. So I have a lot of examples to share with you, and we have some technical details to share as well about what is behind all this. So Bitcoin, as you all probably know, is a cryptocurrency. We're going to talk about that only a little bit tonight, mainly in the section about where did blockchain come from. John Oliver recently defined cryptocurrency on his show as everything you don't understand about money combined with everything you don't understand about computers, which is so accurate. I love it so much. But cryptocurrency is only one application of blockchain technology. Blockchain is the tech that powers Bitcoin, and in our opinion, it's the more interesting part of this story. So, about 3 weeks ago, around the time that we had this idea for the talk, I read this article in the New York Times. I want to just read a quote from a developer quoted in this piece to kind of frame why this story made me think about giving this talk here in this community. Here's what the developer said. She said she works for a cryptocurrency startup, and what she said was, I never felt insecure before I got into this space, but I just realized there's no one else like me. It's a very hard feeling when you don't see anyone who is like you. She's considered leaving the industry. She says, I had this perpetual sense of being on the outside of the conversation. It's just a general state of alienation. So that really hit me kind of hard. When we gather together as a community and we start having these conversations, it makes it easier for other people to come in and have those conversations too. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing this and kind of the backstory of how we got involved in this. An overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to just talk about, the first section of our talk is the history of blockchain, where does it come from? We're going to talk about the basics of the blockchain and go into some applications of how is it being used. And then we're going to look at some of the terms involved. We're going to talk about mining, which is one of those things that I was like, what even is that? That is just total nonsense. Some of it is total nonsense, but there are technical explanations behind everything. I want to shout out to my friend Carrie for this analogy. If you are as old as me, you remember when the internet's promise was dancing hamsters. Hamster dance was like the peak of internet achievement back in the day. And this was what we thought it could do. It's mesmerizing, we love it, don't we? It's great, yeah. So we're kind of at hamster dance stage for blockchain. There are lots of ideas being discussed in a lot of different fields, but the possibilities are largely unwritten right now. So let's kind of look back and see how it got started and start to understand what it is from its origins. I wanted to show you this chart. It's probably impossible to read from where you're sitting, but this is a chart of something called the hype cycle. I mean, hype is something we associate with Bitcoin and blockchain, right? We know it's about the hype. This research firm, Gartner, does a lot of research about like what's the usefulness of emerging technologies in a business setting. And they do this yearly report on the cycle of hype, like what is being hyped that business leaders should watch out for. And they sort of chart this life cycle of technologies. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is blockchain right here on sort of the other side of this peak over here. Out here in like the space where things start to like resolve into usefulness. This is virtual reality, just by way of like a frame of reference for other technologies. So blockchain is up over here, and the stage that they say blockchain is at is we're leaving what they call the peak of inflated expectations, where we have early publicity, we have a lot of success stories that are being reported on, also a lot of failures. Some companies are doing things, other companies are ignoring it. And what we're entering into blockchain right about now is what they call the Trough of Disillusionment, where people are starting to be like, okay, that was a bunch of nonsense and nothing came of that. The initial promise is not delivered on. And the people who are using the technology or who have created the technology start to either like prove that they're really successful or start to fail. And this is where investment kind of is like a make it or break it sort of thing for business leaders. So we're at this interesting point in the hype cycle where the craziness is dying down and things are beginning to settle, and it's a good time for having these kind of measured, thoughtful conversations. So, thank you, sorry. Bitcoin is really the first application of blockchain technology. Bitcoin is a decentralized currency that actually has monetary value. And the way that it runs is by using peer-to-peer networks, protocols, which are how those peers talk to each other, and software. And all these things combine to make it possible to create and to use this digital currency. This is not a new idea, actually. Digital cash as a concept goes back to the early 80s when computers looked like this, if you can believe that. But there were still some persistent problems that couldn't be worked out, and they had to do with the fact that you needed a central authority to verify and keep track of digital cash. So that was a problem that couldn't be solved at the time. Another idea that is involved in blockchain that we're going to talk about in more detail when DeeDee gives you some more technical information was an idea that came about in the late 90s. It was a concept called hash cash. And it was a way to create computational complexity involved in sending an email. And it was designed to thwart the spammers so that you would have a little more of an expense computationally to send a single email. With one email, it's negligible. With millions of emails, it becomes prohibitive. So this was a technology that came around back in the day. Another thing that wasn't really put to any good use. There were other experimental e-cash systems that came around in the 1990s. So the main innovation introduced with blockchain technology is the idea of verification in a decentralized way. And the analogy that I want to make here is that if you're using a credit card right now, you have to actually go to the credit card and pull information from there to verify transactions. They store all the numbers. You have to hit that credit card company and find out if that's actually the right credit card number. The decentralized verification model is a push model instead of a pull model. So you're adding information to a centralized verification, a decentralized verification system with multiple copies of the same record. And in that way, you get around some of the early problems with digital cash. That's a super glossed over kind of explanation, and he's going to go into a lot more detail where it will start to make some sense to you. This graphic, you'll see a lot of people talk about decentralized systems, and I include it here mainly because this is from a paper from 1964 by an engineer who worked for the Rand Corporation. So these thoughts and these thought models have been around for a long time, and the innovation is really putting them all together in a way that creates something new. So in October, late October of 2008, we get the Bitcoin white paper. And this is something you can actually go online and read. We will share the URL for this talk. These slides are deployed, you can go to it. There are links embedded in all of these slides. So I hope you'll go and check some of this stuff out for yourself. The abstract of this white paper says that Bitcoin is purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash, would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. The author of this white paper is known as Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody, except maybe the FBI or CIA or some other people in Russia, know who this is. But publicly, this is still an anonymous person. So in the history of blockchain, the first kind of like opening gambit is this white paper in October of 2008. The software to use Bitcoin becomes available to the public on SourceForge in November of 2008. This is just sort of a historical curiosity, and Dee is going to talk a little bit more about what this really means. The first block in the blockchain, y'all, is just a chain of blocks. That's really it. The first block, called the Genesis block, in any blockchain, the first block is called the Genesis block. This was mined on January 3rd, 2009. So that was sort of the official start of the Bitcoin blockchain. There is about one new block created in this blockchain every 10 minutes, and created is synonymous with mined. And then when you create this block, or you mine this block, you are rewarded with coins, and that's where Bitcoin comes in. In 2010, Bitcoin acquired a value for the first time. The very first public Bitcoin purchase, where Bitcoin was traded with like an actual monetary value, occurred on May 22nd of 2010. This is now known as Bitcoin Pizza Day, because what happened on this day is an unfortunate person whose name is Laszlo, and a name I cannot pronounce, or his last name, bought some pizza. He managed to find a pizza joint that would take Bitcoin, and he paid 10,000 Bitcoins for some pizza. This Twitter account every day will tweet the value of the pizza now. So this is, as of the other day, this is the current value of the Bitcoin pizza is over $20 million, which is a staggering amount of money. There is a website you can go to find out where the nearest pizza joint near you will accept your Bitcoin for pizza. So we have that. And also there are some people who say, this actually doesn't matter at all because these things fluctuate and that's just the way it was. We get one of the first currency exchanges established this year, also Mt. Gox, which you probably heard about if you were paying attention to the news back then, because there was a giant security breach of Mt. Gox where a lot of people lost their money through fraudulent trading. The site was shut down because of that. People lost their money, they were very mad. By the end of this year, 2010, the Bitcoin market is valued at over $1 million. And the following year, in 2011, we start to see altcoin showing up. Altcoin is just a generic term for other digital coins that start showing up. These are forks of the Bitcoin source code, starting with Namecoin and Litecoin, which you probably have heard of if you're following cryptocurrency at all. These alternative cryptocurrencies are just being continuously introduced from this point on. I read stories of people creating currencies just by taking the Bitcoin source code and doing a find and replace all for the word Bitcoin with whatever coin they were making. So it got kind of nutty. So there's a lot of volatility. As we know, this is an all-time high that Bitcoin reached in April of 2013. At that time, the all-time high was $233. You can see that April is right around here. So it hits this all-time high and then it immediately crashes. By the end of the year, it reaches even more all-time high. That high is $1,147. That's December 3rd. And I wanted to show you, just by way of comparison, this chart shows this past year from March to March. So you can just visually get a sense of what is even happening. The high in the past year was in mid-December. That's the peak you see there. It was just over $19,000 for a single Bitcoin. Today, the value is about $9,000. So the volatility is continuing. So time passes. We get a new concept of what blockchain is starting in around 2014. people start to re-envision the possibilities for this technology, that blocks in the chain begin to be used for more than just a transaction record. It's not just the possibilities of an exchange, because you can hold any data in these blocks, can also hold code that can execute or enforce contracts, and it can do that automatically. This is a little bit like a vending machine. You put in your money, you make a selection, you get the candy bar, right? There's no negotiation, there's no variation for that formula. So what the new concept of blockchain does with people thinking about this and coming up with new ideas is a way to embed sort of business logic into those transactions. So Bitcoin is really just the transaction, but the next generation of blockchains introduce this idea of transactions plus the conditions for them. Ethereum is one of the big companies that is involved in smart contracts. Ethereum builds a new blockchain and introduces that in January of 2014. What they say on their website about what it is it is a decentralized platform that runs smart contracts. So these are applications that run exactly as programmed without any possibility of downtime, censorship, fraud, or third-party interference. Other blockchains start appearing also. Ripple, Hyperledger, these are ones you might have heard of. Some are public and open source, and others are private. And what they are intended for, those uses really differ. So there are a lot of possibilities for some of these exchanges for these decentralized applications. So you can exchange currency, but you could also have file storage. You could manage ride sharing. You could manage social messaging. You could actually buy or sell physical items. So companies have started to take advantage of these possibilities, and this term you'll read about the smart economy, like conditions kind of embedded in the transactions themselves, right? So we're combining the assets with your identity and with the contracts that are involved there. This is the logo for a company in China that's really in the news right now. It's a company called Neo. They're doing something different here. And I'm going to read to you a little bit about this. Every individual business or other entity operating on the Neo platform is expected to have a unique digital identity that will be verifiable. So people and businesses and projects have the option to transact among themselves only if the other party has the required identity. So the Neo network is regulatory compliant. Really interesting new possibilities. There's a lot of sort of push and pull around like how this is going to work. There are a lot of restrictions. The Chinese government has cracked down on this, so it's kind of like yet to be seen how this is going to shake out. And where are we right now? We're kind of in the third phase of blockchain. The term that I personally think is most exciting is this idea of the decentralized web. And I'm going to throw out a bunch of ideas to you, and we're going to embroider upon this as we go through tonight. But if you start thinking about the internet as being decentralized, meaning like taken out of its actual physical context so that you have an internet that is transnational or like a-national, not even at all tied to geography, this starts to bring up concepts of like freedom and empowerment, getting around government restrictions, getting around censorship. International business can be facilitated by these organizations that are not associated with governments or with countries. They're not controlled by any of those organizations or those governments. So once we take the information out of the geographical servers, right, they're not subject to local jurisdiction anymore. Namecoin that I mentioned earlier as actually the first fork of the Bitcoin source code wants to promote this decentralized DNS. So in this system, top-level name domains don't exist anymore, right? Blockstack is a company that is promoting basically an alternative internet. So what they say about themselves is Blockstack is a new internet for decentralized apps that you access through the Blockstack browser. With Blockstack, there's a new world of apps that let you own your data and maintain your privacy, security, and freedom. So don't use Google Docs anymore, use a decentralized app because Google's reading all your Google Docs, Google's reading your email and using all that data to sell you stuff and who knows what else they're using. With a decentralized application, you can circumvent some of that because that information is no longer owned by another company?
A blockchain is basically a digital ledger or list of sequential transactions that is immutable or unable to be changed. Now there's some argument about the word immutable, right? You can always change things, but it's really super hard, and you'll see why as we get into it. So each transaction is cryptographically signed, and there are many copies of the blockchain distributed throughout the network, so there's no need for a central authority. A block is basically a chunk of data. And blocks are chained together because each block includes a reference to the block that came before it. That's like really simple, right? That's the chain. It's just a reference to the block before it. They're linked. So you can see what we mean by the reference, right? We're going to talk more about proof of work later on, but I wanted you to have that visual. This is a visual of the blockchain. Pretty simple, right? Okay. So, go ahead, yeah. Before we talk more about blocks and their components, I want to take a small detour. And I want to talk about two cryptographic concepts that underpin the blockchain technology: hashing and digital signatures. So using a hashing function or algorithm, any input can be represented by this fixed length outcome, or what we call a hash. You can think of it as a fingerprint or a unique identifier. But when I say any input, I really mean any input. We have one word over there. You could have the entire history of the world, and it could be hashed, and you would get this fingerprint or unique identifier. Any input goes through the algorithm, and you get a hash. It's very fast. Should be. And it's irreversible. And what I mean by that is that you can't take a hash value and work backward to figure out what the original input was. Now, you might get lucky and guess it. And if you guess it, we call that a brute force attack. It should also avoid collisions. In other words, each input or each message has its own hash value, right? And then the last thing is an avalanche effect. And this is basically saying that even if you change one tiny little thing, you flip a single bit, the output or the hash changes significantly, like maybe half the bits are flipped. Okay? So those are things about hashing to keep in mind. There are publicly available tools to do this. MD5 was one of the first that was like a sort of standard hashing tool. That is now so unsophisticated that if you put an MD5 hash into Google, it will actually tell you what the original message was. So don't use MD5. Then along came secure hash algorithms. SHA-1 was eventually replaced by SHA-2. SHA-2 is has 6 digests, family of these algorithms. And a very common one is SHA-256. People have heard of this, seen it? Basically it says, no matter how big or small your input is, the output will always have a fixed hash of 256 bits in length. So some everyday examples: passwords, emails, Git, right? Your Git commit identifier or number is basically a hash of all the data. Let's talk about digital signatures. This is really important because if you're going to do a transaction on the blockchain, you have to be able to verify or prove who you are. So public and private keys go together as a set. They're inseparable. And of course, each pair is unique. The public key belongs to the corresponding private key and only that key. The public key is what encrypts data, and the private key decrypts the data. So for instance, Bob wants to send Alice a message, right? He wants to say, hello, Alice. So he finds Alice's public key. His message is encrypted. it comes to Alice, she decrypts it using her private key and gets the message from Bob. Very simplistic, but kind of a visual to help understand digital signatures. So these protocols that secure things like websites and emails and web applications all over the world, right? Protect your private key. Do you know where your private key is? Keep that thing safe. Okay, back to blocks. So, some of the components of a block. You said it was just a chunk of data. We want to look in a little deeper. So you have the data, which is transactions, a list of transactions or records or contracts, conditions, etc. And then you have something that is called a Merkle tree. It's basically a hash tree that represents the history of the blockchain. Then you have a nonce. We're going to talk more about that little guy, who plays a really important role. It's basically just an arbitrary number, and I mean really, it's just a random number. And then of course you have the reference to the block before, right? Previous block's hash. Okay, these four components are then hashed to create a new and unique hash that becomes then the identifier for that block. Okay? All right, here's a visual representation of that. So you see your transactions or your data, the Merkle tree, which is the history of the transactions, the previous block hash, plus your transactions and your hashes, plus this random number, are hashed together to create a unique block hash. Okay, there's a visual of the block. That once a block has been verified, added to the chain, a copy is sent to every node in the network. This is peer-to-peer network work. This is also described as distributed. I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah. You saw a version of this in Amy's slide, right? So this is what we're talking about, peer-to-peer. Everybody gets a copy. You sometimes hear blockchains referred to as trustless. Has anybody heard that? So that term is a little ambiguous and it's a little bit inaccurate. The mechanisms that are in place help all the parties in the system reach a consensus about what the canonical truth is. And we're going to talk more about that later, right? That's something you touched on, sort of the consensus algorithm. But what that does is it distributes and shares the trust, and let's be real, the power, among the network's stakeholders, developers, miners, consumers. And instead of being concentrated in a single individual or entity, such as a bank or government or financial institution. So when they say trustless, what they mean is the trust is distributed. Okay? So there are all different types of blockchains. Amy mentioned, I think, like some of all of these. So there's the public blockchain. This is like for the people, by the people, and of the people. Basically like Bitcoin. There's no single person who has the power to validate transactions. Anyone can participate. Nobody is in charge. It can be used when you want your system to be truly democratic. Anyone can create a smart contract or transfer money or contribute data. And here, users are likely to remain anonymous. In a private blockchain, it's the property of an individual or organization. Still a secure ledger, but lacking the accessibility and transparency of the blockchain as it was imagined in its public form. Now, the permissioned blockchains can be public or private. The access control mechanisms and the distribution can vary, depending on the situation. And then a consortium blockchain is a group of companies or representative individuals who come together and make the decisions for the benefit of the whole network.
So in this next section, we're going to go through just a bunch of use cases and kind of point to things that are currently being done or being planned or being talked about. And what I want to preface this with is it's going to be a lot, like a sort of rambling through a lot of different industries and fields. And I'm going to share some headlines with you and give you a sense of the breadth of this. And what I'd like to ask ask you to do as you look at the slides and listen to this is just kind of let all the good and the bad wash over you. I don't know if it's really good or really bad. I think that that's still, something we have to figure out as a society. But I'd like you to just sort of let these things percolate in your brain and let the implications sink in as we go through these examples. I'm not going to point out all the implications, but I feel like a lot of these are kind of mind-blowing. So in most cases, the promise of the blockchain has to do with decentralizing the power to certify or verify something of value. If you apply that concept of decentralization to any industry or institution or organizational structure, you get some idea of the wide-ranging and fundamental change that some people are envisioning when they talk about this. It's sort of like a crazy light where this kind of comes from. Blockchain doesn't even have to be the revolutionary thing people sometimes describe it as to begin to be used for small gains and incremental improvements. There are some skeptics, and we're going to get to that kind of at the end of this section. We'll talk about some of the naysayers of blockchain technology. So, what the internet did for communications, blockchain will do for trusted transactions. Let this thing sink in for a moment. What role did the internet play in your life 10 to 15 years ago? Can you imagine a technology that has a similar impact on transactions? If she's right, this is huge. And we need to be thinking of ways to help steer and participate in its implementation. It's one of the reasons why we wanted to invite you all here tonight, hoping that you'll go out and have these conversations with other people. So some of the industries that are thinking about or using blockchain right now, these are just some headlines in the real estate field. The World Bank reports that 70% of the world's population still lacks access to proper land titling or demarcation. And why that's important is the status of land rights can affect an individual's access to economic opportunity. So this group, the World Bank Group, quotes some research that shows that women with secure land rights earn more income, are better able to feed their children, less likely to experience domestic violence. The women's right to access, control, transfer, exclude, inherit, and otherwise make decisions about land and the resources related to land improves all of her economic potential and opportunities. It gives her greater influence over her household income and her expenses, and overall her bargaining and decision-making power. So this is a really important problem in a lot of other countries that governments and NGOs are starting to think about using blockchain for. And it's actually starting to happen in Sweden, and there's a startup that's working in Brazil to make this start happening there.
As a few examples.
Just a few examples, yeah. Another area where blockchain is being talked about with a lot of enthusiasm is large-scale commercial applications, right? Startups like Provenance want to address supply chain issues, for example, food and product safety. It's easier to find the origin of the problems and to find everything that has been subsequently affected quickly and efficiently. Think about recalls for salmonella, think about tainted lettuce or whatever it is, like finding where that came from and everything else that's related becomes suddenly a lot easier when you have a ledger of all those transactions. So this startup says, we envision a future where every physical product has a digital history, allowing you to trace and verify its origins, attributes, and ownership. The pharmaceutical industry really likes blockchain because it will allow them to keep hold of drugs. Where are they? Eliminate counterfeit drugs, make sure that the people who are supposed to have the right drugs have them. They're real excited about this. MIT is already issuing their diplomas digitally to some of their students. They're piloting this program. So I was telling somebody who's not in tech about this, and he was like, what, will you just get on your smartphone? I'm like, thinking like that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Yes, that is what has happened. You can get your diploma on your smartphone instead of like a physical copy that you can bring. I don't know if people want that, but that is happening. So there is a company called BlockCerts, and you can go to blockcerts.org. they are creating blockchain-based certificates for things like activities and extracurricular things, as well as for credit things. So you get an app on your smartphone and you can receive things through that. Further out though, this is an interesting idea to me because if you think about decentralization, you apply it to educational institutions, maybe credentials don't have to be issued by an institution anymore. This could change the whole way we think about accreditation and formal schooling. And it can open the way for other credentials to be verified, in ways other than by degree granting institutions. That's sort of interesting. This is another piece. You get a lot of talk around this. How will or can elections be changed by a digital ledger? So voting and election monitoring start to look really different with a decentralized verification system. Again, think about something that's transnational. There's a company, a startup called Follow My Vote, and they are currently raising funding to, as they say, to build a secure online voting platform that will allow for greater election transparency. They actually have this quote from Stalin on their website, which is like, you never see quotes from Stalin, but this is front and center. And it's a great quote. It really, kind of evokes something. It says, it's enough that the people know there was an election. The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything. I mean, chilling, but you get the point. Maybe my favorite slide, I don't know. So guess what? The days of fake IDs could be numbered with blockchain because identity and records start to look very different in this system, right? So I'm just going to list a whole bunch of things that suddenly can be on the blockchain and no longer on a piece of paper in your wallet or in a drawer or in your fireproof safe. Driver's licenses, identity cards, passports, social security cards, voter registration, proof of insurance, anything you have notarized, copyrights, patents, trademarks, private records like IOUs to your friend, bets you've made, contracts, wills, trusts, anything you sign, public records like vehicle registrations, business licenses, marriage certificates, birth or death certificates. We're talking cradle to grave records on the blockchain. On a more serious note, I want to mention immigration status. There is an advisory committee to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency. This U.S. Customs and Border Protection, they advise the secretaries of the U.S. Treasury, the advisory committee advises the secretaries of the U.S. Treasury and the Department of Homeland Security on the commercial operations of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency. This committee is currently doing research into blockchain technology for applications in, quote, licenses, permits, certificate of origin reporting, and free trade agreement product qualifications and bonded movement tracking. So tracking people is suddenly possible and very practical with blockchain technology. Energy is also another thing people get real excited about. The electric grid, we know, is decaying. It's no longer as effective as it used to be when it was created. For the most part, we still have these massive centralized power plants that generate power and then send it long distances over distribution lines. It's not efficient, it's very costly, and there are places in the world that don't have the power that they need. So there are there's lots of people talking about this, but these are just two kind of to show you the sort of like span of this. In Brooklyn, there's a startup, yes, of course it's in Brooklyn, a startup called Brooklyn Microgrid. And this lets people sell electricity to each other directly. Like if you have a solar panel and you don't want to sell your electricity to the power company, you can sell it to your other friend who's on the microgrid. They're doing workshops in their community. That's what that graphic is about. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there is the Energy Web Foundation, which is a global nonprofit organization, and they're partnering with companies across the globe to figure out how to use blockchain technology to solve some of the world's energy problems. That organization has raised about $17 million US to date. I find this really fascinating. The art world is excited about the blockchain. So this headline right here ran in the British Telegraph last November. How long has it taken to find these stolen paintings and prove ownership, right? Like we are still doing this. This is crimes that were committed in the Second World War, and we are still trying to untangle these things and to right some of these wrongs. So there are companies that are starting up and trying to use blockchain technology to address some of these ownership and fraud issues in the art world. The art world has been plagued by this for a long time. So Verisart is a company that addresses these issues, and they want to prove authenticity, prove ownership. So this is from their website. By using the blockchain, Verisart provides digital provenance to physical works that can be verified online and in real time. There's another startup in the art space. This is like blowing my mind. It's called Mycenas, and this is them at the bottom here. If you can see it, the decentralized art gallery. They call themselves a new online marketplace, which promises to give art lovers the chance to buy shares in famous paintings. Which means, just like you don't own a single one Bitcoin, you can own a fraction of a Bitcoin, you can own a fraction of a Warhol. This is a thing that could actually be happening. And if you think about it for a minute, this could change a lot about the way ownership works in the art world, or people who collect, or how museums acquire works, and own a share in a painting. Digital marketing and advertising is another industry that is going to be affected by this. I just learned about this in the last few days and threw this slide in here because it just blew my mind. There is a new type of token that's coming out. It's called the Basic Attention Token. And it is a way of tracking and quantifying people's attention to ads on the internet. So one of the reasons why this is interesting is that the creator of JavaScript, Brendan Eich, is one of the founders of this startup. And here's how they describe what they're doing. They've created their own browser also. So I'm going to quote from a marketing blog about what they do. The Basic Attention Token is a system attempting to fix what's broken about digital advertising. This startup that's using the Basic Attention Token, imagine the solution as a triangle where rewards flow from advertisers, these are the points of the triangle, to anonymized ad viewers and to publications providing quality content, so the user, the advertiser, and the publisher. Ad viewers can also reward publications through subscriptions or one-time tips. It's really kind of a weird concept. They created their own browser, which is fast, open source, and privacy-focused. It blocks ads, it blocks trackers, and it contains a ledger system that anonymously measures user attention aggregate to accurately reward publishers. This is an entirely different model for how marketing currently works on the internet. Another huge category, and I'm only going to just touch on this so that we can get to the next piece, but the Internet of Things. The blockchain suddenly makes it a lot easier and a lot more possible for machine-to-machine transactions. So these are examples of things like micropayments and smart contracts between connected devices, right? So for example, we're already using smart thermostats, right? Adjust the temperature in your home according to certain conditions. Your smartphone can unlock your door or lock your door, or check on other things in your house. Here's another scenario. Your smart alarm clock knows that school is canceled for snow and can let you sleep later. Smart buildings know which rooms are more frequently occupied and where the lights and the heat or the cooling needs to go. What about something like predictive maintenance on your car, where your car knows when there's a problem already, orders the replacement parts, schedules the repair before you get stranded? Some of this sounds pretty good, also pretty scary. And that brings us to the skepticism.
Okay, so blockchain is cool, but is it practical? I don't know if you could read this slide, but I'm going to read it for you. Now, it's true that this happens with all sorts of tech, but let's apply it to blockchain tonight. So a rational solutioning process is, what's the business problem? What should the solution do? What technology should we use? Is that how it works at y'all's companies? The FOMO solutioning process, and let's just define FOMO, fear of missing out. You must do something with the blockchain. What can I do with the blockchain? Here's a business problem that sounds blockchain-y. So, just Bitcoin, okay? Not any other blockchain. The annual electricity consumption for Bitcoin mining is approximate to the same electricity usage for the country of Israel. The electricity consumed during a single transaction could power 28 US households for a day. So Bitcoin wallets and exchanges have continually been hacked. Scams are active. Maybe your password to a third-party service is stolen. Your private key, keep your private key private, is compromised or stolen. Maybe you're scammed out of your Bitcoin. This is what Wozniak said. I had 7 Bitcoins stolen from me through fraud. Someone bought them from me online with a credit card, and then they canceled the credit card payment. It was that easy. And guess what? It was a stolen credit card number. So he did not get his Bitcoin back. The next slide is hard to think about. This has just come out in the last day or two. Now here's what this means. Remember how a copy of all the Bitcoin transactions is on every new block? So that means that if you have acquired Bitcoin after the date at which this was added, you're now guilty of being in possession of child abuse imagery. So there may be no more Bitcoin. I don't know. But this is complicated, right? This path that this line takes on this chart is identical to the path that the internet took, right? But let's look where we are. What did you call this, Amy? The Trough of Disillusionment? So we don't know yet what the future is for blockchain. We don't know. But let's look a little deeper at the technology so that we understand it and we can be a part of the conversation of how it's implemented and used if it succeeds. A quick overview. Sorry if this is hard to read. So A wants to send money to B. That transaction is represented online as a block, right? Block is just a chunk of data. We talked about that. The block is then broadcast to every party in the network. This is kind of where we left off. Those in the network approve the transaction as valid. The block's added to the chain and provides an indelible and transparent record of all transactions. The money moves from A to B. Does that make sense? All right, so let's talk about step 4. Mining. This is where miners validate new transactions and record them on the blockchain or ledger. And this is what it looks like. Okay, thank you for indulging me. That's the only laugh I probably will get for the rest of the night. Okay, so the miners work. This is a lot. They have to get the most recent copy of the blockchain. Okay? Well, if you're a miner, while you're working on mining a block, somebody could have finished one. So now you have to abandon the work that you did and you have to start again, which means getting that most recent copy, okay? So you have the most recent copy of the blockchain, then you gather the recent unrecorded transactions from the transaction pool. And blocks, for every ecosystem, there are different rules, but for Bitcoin, for instance, it's like 1 megabyte or something like that. That's the size of the block. So if you're going to create a candidate block, you're only going to get as many transactions as can fit, right? Now, the miner adds their Coinbase transaction. And let me explain what that means. This is how new coins are created. So if you mine 1 Bitcoin block, you receive as a reward 12.5 Bitcoin. Okay? You also, as a reward, collect transaction fees for all of these transactions that you pull together. Okay? So once you've done all this, then you have to do your proof of work. Okay, so the proof of work is basically just looking for the correct nonce that will achieve the correct level of difficulty, which is represented by that hash and its leading number of zeros. So picture 256 bits, right? We talked about the hash. This changes over time. right now, you have to remember all that data that we had in the block. And we said the only thing that's gonna solve this proof of work is a random number, that nonce. So the miners are actually trying random nonces until it combines with all that other data to produce the correct hash value. Correct is the wrong word. Until it produces a hash value that meets the requirement or the definition of the level of difficulty. So if you picture like, I'm gonna hash all this data, I'm gonna get a random number, that's my hash value. I have to keep doing that, changing the nonce every time until my random hash value just happens to have 72 leading zeros. About 10 minutes. So that's actually how the level of difficulty is defined, is by how many leading zeros have to be in that random hash value.
Yeah.
It's like winning the lottery, okay? There is nothing in your brain that is going to help you mine this block. It is just a random number. You just have to find it first. Okay, so this is so tiny. Can you see it? I was hoping getting bigger would help, but it hasn't. So here's the block. Remember all that stuff we talked about that was in the block? Here's our hashing algorithm, okay? Still using SHA-256. And we're going to increment the nonce by 1. And we're going to try it again if it's not in our target range, right? The leading number is zeros. That's the qualifier for achieving the correct. If you get a hash with 72 leading zeros, you won that block. You won the lottery. If not, you got to change the nonce again. Now don't change it by 1 because that's not going to get you anywhere. You just do these random nonces nonstop. If you get really good at mining, we're going to change the difficulty level. So in the beginning, it might have been like, this is a guess, okay? I don't remember this fact. It could be like 4 leading zeros or 10 leading zeros. And over time, as people have gotten faster, I think it's reviewed every 2 weeks. How fast are people mining blocks? Programmatically, the difficulty is increased. So now we're up to 72 leading zeros. So real quickly, these are like the basic pieces of any blockchain's ecosystem. So you have a node application, and now the nodes are basically the computers, right? Or you could think of it as a person, right? A person in a computer or just a computer, whatever. But you have to have the application for that blockchain. So for Bitcoin, you have to have, oh God, the name of it just flew out of my head. Somebody here knows. It's like the Bitcoin wallet or something, application. And then once you have that application, then you can participate in the blockchain ecosystem, right? Now, the shared ledger is that data structure that's managed through inside the node or inside the application, right? So once your application is running, you can view the ledger, the blockchain, for that ecosystem. Now the consensus algorithms, this is basically like the rules of the game, and it's going to be different for any blockchain ecosystem. You have your verification process, which we call mining. Now you should know that in private blockchains, mining is not really a thing, and you can picture why, right? It's private, they're doing their own thing, they're writing their own rules. Somebody had asked earlier, like, what happens if 2 blocks get the proof of work completed at the same time? And so one of your consensus algorithms might be that over some number of minutes, you choose the longest fork of the chain, right? Like so you have the blockchain, everybody has the same copy, but then 2 blocks are mined. Well, then people are going to start mining off those blocks, right? So after a few minutes, whoever has the longest chain is now considered the canonical truth. And if you pull down, right, that updated copy of the blockchain, then you're going to get that longest chain. So that can be, those rules of the game change depending on your ecosystem. And then a virtual machine. This is like an abstraction of a machine inside a machine. It's kind of complicated, but basically what it means is that it understands a wider range of instructions that make it possible to manage that state of the blockchain, right, the digital contracts.
where do you go from here? Like, you are at some stage of your career, you're at in some kind of industry, maybe you're just curious in general, maybe you actually want to work with this stuff. I want to give you some ideas about what to do next. So there is a Women in Blockchain meetup group. It's actually like an Uber group. It's sort of like organizing all the subgroups that are in these different locations all around the world. Raleigh-Durham does not have a group yet. Just want to point that out in case anyone here is inspired. Like I said, I'm going to share the URL for where these slides are hosted, so you can go back and kind of pull out some of this data for yourself. But I wanted to just say there are a lot of really influential and interesting women who are involved in blockchain in some way, as a journalist or as an entrepreneur or an educator or something, who are on Twitter and who have a lot of interesting things to say and often share things that they have done themselves to help people learn. So there's a lot of good information to be had there. There's actually a podcast hosted by a woman on blockchain. It's called Unchained. If you click on this text when you have your copy of the slides, it will take you to that website. And again, some resources that you might find useful. The first two are written by women. The third is not, but I couldn't resist including it because it's one of those mega lists of resources that you get on GitHub that's like awesome this and awesome that, awesome blockchain. So I had to put that in there. And if you haven't done this yet, watch John Oliver. I love him. He's awesome. And he recently did a whole piece on cryptocurrencies. It's mostly about Bitcoin. And his part about blockchain, he's like, no one understands it. It's really crazy.
But now you all do, right?
But now you actually understand more than John Oliver did about blockchain. And his team is amazing, so that is saying something. That's really it. That's what we have. Thank you for your attention. This was really fun for me, and it was great to work with DeeDee. Thanks for coming out. That's it.